welcome to another edition of One More Light with me, Val KLEINHANS, where we break the stigma when it comes to mental health. We love talking to peers. We love talking to experts. Sadie Sutton is one of those people. She is in the building. She's a fellow podcaster and fellow mental health advocate. Sadie, I am thrilled that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
There's a couple of reasons why I wanted you here today. There's a lot of reasons why I gravitated toward you and your brand. Firstly, your drive and focus on your own podcast is admirable and very relatable to me. I also read that you went through your own treatment for depression and anxiety, which I have been through too. And then I read that you're a psychology major in my home state. I don't know if you still are, but I read that. When did
Yeah,
you know? So, when did you know that you wanted to major in psychology?
it's funny. I like before treatment and everything, I always like the idea of helping people, especially when they were in like a darker, lower point. And so I thought I wanted to go into medicine and do pre med. But I really identified with people that were struggling or in crisis or being able to support them through that. And
Mm.
then I went through my own mental health journey and for like the first year and a half after, I was like, there's no way I could ever do something in the mental health space. It would be too triggering. It would hit too close to home. How would I possibly be able to maintain my mental health while being surrounded by people that were in such a dark place? And when it came time to write my college applications and think about what I wanted to do, first I'd taken AP chemistry and I was like, this is not for me. Like, there's so much
No,
in
chemistry,
math.
mm-mm.
It was
Bye.
it's not fun. So that was definitely a key part of the equation. But I also realized that I'd been having these conversations week after week, investing hundreds of hours into this podcast and really just diving deep into mental health and my story and the dark parts, but also all the good that can come of that and all the different ways you have agency to take control of your mental health. And I was like, this hasn't been a detriment to my mental health in any way. If anything, it's held me accountable to continue to recover and iterate and improve upon what I initially learned. And I was like, there's no, I can't do anything else. There's no other option. I love this. I'm so passionate about it. And I just wanted to continue down that path. So I'm a junior now at the University of Pennsylvania, like you mentioned, continuing to do all the things psychology, lots of research, lots of psych classes, and I just love it so much. It's incredible, and I just feel so aligned with what I'm interested in.
Wow. Okay, so at what point does the script flip and you decide I'm going to go public with all this? Because you weren't comfortable at first.
Yeah, yeah. So it's funny. I started treatment halfway through my freshman year of high school, and like the cliff notes, I'm sure we'll dive into this more in the experience and all the things, but I tried everything locally, still depressed, still anxious, still suicidal, still self harming. Just life was a disaster. It was so distressing and had such a huge level of impairment on my functioning that I wasn't able to go to class. I was having all these panic
Mm.
attacks and was so depressed and all the things. And nothing was really shifting that. And so my parents and treatment team kind of decided that the next step had to be a higher level of care. Been hospitalized 4 times, tried everything, and the next step was a residential program. And my parents did a ton of research. They found the most incredible residential program right outside of Boston called 3 East at McLean Hospital. If you have a teen who's depressed or anxious or struggling with relationships or absolutely suicidal and self-harming, they are the best of the best. They know what they're doing, completely evidence-based, the most incredible, compassionate team. And I spent 14 weeks there. And when I started at McLean, we flew across the country. I had no idea what this journey would look like. I just knew that I couldn't be at home anymore. And
Mm.
my life was now going to be all consumed by treatment because that was how much I was struggling. And that was how small and dark and scary my life had gotten at that point. And we go into this intake meeting where you're meeting with like 12 or 15 of your clinicians, and it's
Yep.
psychiatrists and therapists and counselors and social workers and educators, and everyone's there and kind of hearing your story and like starting to get you introduced to the program. And the first question that they asked me was, do you want to be here? And like, no brainer, of course I didn't want to be there. I was 14.
Yeah.
I just learned I was going to live in a mental hospital that Girl Interrupted was based off of. I was
What?
terrified.
A script?
Yeah.
Really? Wait, how did you find that
Yeah.
out? How did you find out that that
Well,
was
I
the
googled
hospital?
McLean, and the one of the first things was like Girl Interrupted was actually based on the person that wrote that book went to McLean, and so then the movie was an
Oh,
adaptation of the book. Yeah.
wow.
So me
That's
being
incredible.
14, I'm like, what am I doing with my life? Like I'm so
Yeah.
scared. Um, But it was a really pivotal point, and we'll talk about this more. But it was the first time where I was backed into a corner and really had to decide if I wanted to have some level of control over my treatment or continue down this path where I was going through the motions and others were deciding that this was in my best interest, but there was no buy-in. And so that was a huge game changer, and that was really when things started moving in the right direction. But when I started at McLean, my dad is really into storytelling. He's a really
Mm.
creative person. He has always been a big fan of storytelling. He's super passionate about that. And he was like, so many teenage girls struggle with depression and anxiety and are in the exact same position as you. And you're about to embark on this journey of intensive work on yourself. And they had so much trust and faith in the team at McLean. They knew that we were going to at least get somewhere when it came to my mental health. And he was like, you should document this. You should record this. Think about how inspiring it'll be for everyone to listen to. Like, you have to do a podcast. And I am like hating the world, blaming all my problems on my parents. Like, are you kidding me, Dad? I'm not making a podcast about having to live in a mental hospital because I'm so depressed. Like, I was not happening, like, not even remotely. Like, I could barely talk to a therapist and be like, yeah, I'm really sad, like, let alone broadcasting to the world.
Right.
And so I was like, not a chance. And then we're in this intake meeting, and he's like, is she allowed to have a microphone here? She might do a
Oh
podcast.
my God.
We're like, that's like the biggest violation of HIPAA. No, she can't do a
Yeah.
podcast. Like, what are you talking about? And he's like,
Oh my
oh,
God.
okay, well, maybe I'll send it just in case. I'm like,
Yeah,
Dad, this is so
that
embarrassing. I'm gonna
that is such
be
a
here,
dad response too. Like,
right?
let me just do this anyway, even though I said, I'm still gonna do it.
Just in
I'm
case
still gonna
she
do
might
it.
want to.
Just in case. I'm still gonna do it. That's such a dad response.
Right? And so the seed had been planted, but there was no interest in doing that at that point. But a year and a half later, I had finished up 14 months at a therapeutic boarding school, which you can also talk about, on top of the 14 weeks at residential. And I'd done a complete 180 with regards to my mental health. I entered suicidally depressed, self harming, anxious, no healthy relationships, the lowest self esteem you can imagine,
Mm.
no will to get better, no hope that I would get better, no belief that I was capable of recovery, like absolute lowest of lows, worst that you can get. And a year and a half later, I not only subjectively was like happy and stable and not all consumed with my mental health challenges, but I also was so like bought in and hopeful to the idea that teens can take ownership of their mental health and that it was so possible for them to improve their lives even if they have less autonomy than adults. And that was one of the biggest things that I was aware of when I went through my journey, was that there was this kind of like echo chamber of fellow teens that were struggling and in treatment. But if you're doing well and happy as a teen, you're not necessarily talking about what you're doing that's working and what's allowing you to thrive. And so you're really just surrounded by all this. I don't want to call it negativity because it is people's genuine experiences, but there's not that voice saying, I also am a teen. I also have been where you're at. I
Mm.
have recovered and it's possible for you to do the same. And I was so, so, so lucky when it came to the resources I'd access to and how involved my parents were, how much they advocated for me. And then once we got through that process, it was like so much of this could have been preventable. So much of this pain and
Mm.
suffering could have been avoided if I had the skill set and had the mindset and had the just like interest in improving my life. And so I felt so compelled to share that. And I went back to that idea that my dad had suggested, which was the podcast. And I started recording it actually while I was still in treatment. I was at a therapeutic boarding school. It was so bad. It was like on an iPod Touch, edited in iMovie. I was horrible at holding a conversation. The audio was beyond horrendous. Like, couldn't have been worse. But I just taught myself. Like, I didn't have a budget to have anyone help me. Like, I didn't know any other teens hosting podcasts. And so I started sharing my story, started talking about my own experiences, interviewing my friends, interviewing my parents and clinicians, and trying to
Mm.
kind of paint a picture of what suffering in a teen can look like, especially when they're not talking about it. Because that was really true
Mm.
for me. I wasn't like, I'm struggling, I need help. I was like a vault of, I am so sad and so alone, but there is no way I feel comfortable being vulnerable about this. And then as it kind of evolved, it was like I can only talk about my own journey so much. And I started kind of sharing more of what I learned in residential, having fellow peers on and experts and creating this all around resource that I wish I would have had when I was struggling. And it's been really incredible to share that not only with teens, but with parents of teens who don't have that insight to what their teen is experiencing.
Mhm.
And you mentioned how I like initially wasn't gonna share, or like I wasn't totally open to talking about that. And it's funny because I did the podcast like anonymously for the first year. Like I didn't share it with my
Oh.
circle, I didn't share it with my community. I was posting about it on this like nevertheless with Sadie Sutton account, but I wasn't actually sharing the podcast with anyone that I knew in real life. I'd also just started a new high school and I didn't want to be that girl that was like, I host mental health podcast. Yes, I used to be super depressed, but like, hi. And so I definitely kept it kind of close to home for a while. And then once I had a year under my belt and I felt really confident and proud of the way I was telling my story, and I knew it was empowering people and not just, I don't want to say depressing people, but it was in a way that was really uplifting and inspiring, and brought hope. I started to share it with anyone and everyone, and I've just continued. So we're 180 episodes in and 4 years into this journey, and I just absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite ways I spend my time, and yeah, I'm just so proud and passionate.
Yes, it's such a fun medium too because you can get as creative with it as you want to. I mean, really, like it's so fun to do. I enjoy it. I've always enjoyed broadcasting. That's what I got my degree in. I tried radio for a bit, got out of it for my own mental health for a lot of the same reasons. That was the source of my own depression and anxiety and everything that I sought treatment for. But I was 28 years old. I can't imagine going through that at 14. So take me back to that time. Was it typical teenage stuff that was going on? What was the origin of your depression and your anxiety?
Yeah, so that was one of the biggest things I struggled with when I was really in it, was that there wasn't a reason I was depressed or anxious. I just
Mm.
remember my mental health slowly deteriorating, and I didn't remember feeling different. I didn't remember feeling happy or fulfilled or passionate, and that's like that depression mindset where you're like, I've only ever felt this way and I will only ever feel this way for the rest of my life. But
Yeah.
as a teen, I felt like that was amplified because like you don't remember when you were younger, you don't have much control over these things. And so I was like, I am not capable of feeling any different. And hindsight's 2020. A lot of therapy and a lot of reflection has given me insight into how I got to the point that I was at. And a big part of that was my belief systems. I
Mm.
believed that I wasn't deserving of love. And so relationships are like essential and key and crucial to our functioning. And so if you don't believe that you're deserving of those relationships and worthy of as a person of being happy and connected and enjoying your life, you're not going to live that life because you don't think you deserve it. And so it was that self-esteem piece. It was the that like belief that I'd only felt this way and was only capable of feeling this way, that kind of I was the outlier and my brain was just meant to be depressed, and that sucks, but that's the cards I've been dealt. I also really didn't believe I was ever going to be good enough for my parents. And your parents are a huge support system. And so it made it
Yeah.
harder to go to them and say, I'm not doing well, or I need support, or all those things. And so that was another piece of the puzzle. And then I was really, really avoidant. I did not like experiencing my emotions. I've always been really sensitive. And with mental health, your emotions are really strong and overwhelming. And the more we
Hmm.
avoid them, the more amplified they become. And so that like perfect storm of I felt really strong emotions, I would suppress and avoid them as much as possible. I, as a person, like need a lot of validation, didn't know how to give that to myself, and also wasn't having the conversations that would allow those emotions and experiences to be validated. Just created this whole mess of depression and anxiety. And I got to the point where I was halfway through my eighth grade year and I was struggling with self harm. I was just really depressed, not sleeping, not eating a lot, super withdrawn, low energy, lethargic. I'd
Hmm.
isolated myself from all my friends, was in unhealthy relationships, wasn't talking to my parents, crying all the time, more conflict, all the things that come with being depressed. And I went to the pediatrician and they did the typical depression questionnaire, and that was the first time anyone had like listed out everything I was experiencing. And I was like,
Yes.
yeah, that is what I'm experiencing. And I don't know if I just had blinders on, or again, there was that belief that like I didn't even deserve the pain that I was experiencing, that I didn't even mentally understand that I was depressed. I think teens are getting better at identifying that and then asking for support accordingly. But
Mhm.
that was the first time anyone had ever been like, you're depressed and this isn't normal. And there are things we can do to support you. And so I ended up being hospitalized for the first time at that point. I was 13. And then the next year that followed was more hospitalizations, really struggling with suicidal
Mm.
ideation, and trying all the things that you do when it comes to mental health, whether it's medication management, family therapy, occupational therapy,
Yeah.
outpatient DBT, intensive outpatient programs, literally anything and everything. But again, there was no buy in. There was no belief that I was capable of recovery or worthy of being happy. And I was going through the motions, but it really wasn't sticking. And so that residential really was that turning point, because I, for the first time, cultivated the like smallest ounce of self compassion. I remember how I framed it to myself. I was like, I don't believe that this is going to work in 6 weeks. I don't believe that I'm going to be happy at the end of this. But
Mm.
maybe like 40 years from now, I could feel slightly less sad than I feel today. And like that was the amount of
Yeah.
hope I had. And but that was like progress, because before I was like, I hate everything. My life sucks. It's never going to change. All the negative beliefs. And so that tiny bit of self compassion and that trust of the individuals around me to support me and help me through it, and also knowing objectively that DBT really works for teens that are depressed and anxious and struggling with self harm and suicidal ideation, and logically knowing I couldn't say this isn't going to work because it does work. And so all of that together really put me on the right path. And my parents were super involved and invested, which was a huge game changer when it came
Mhm.
to kind of reframing my home environment. And yeah, I was just so lucky with the resources I had access to.
Very lucky. And it's funny how you had the same experience that I did with the questionnaire. That was when I realized, I think it was like a Q9 or something that they call it today. Whatever. I got it at Mayo Clinic. I got it with my primary care doctor, because I went to her just because I knew that I was feeling sad, and I was like, I'll just talk to her and maybe I'll get some meds. Like, I didn't think it would get any deeper than that
Yeah.
until I got the questionnaire. And then I was like, ugh, and I started crying in front of her.
Me
I
too.
started
Yeah, I
crying
started
in front of
sobbing.
her because I was like, this is me. I
Yeah.
can't like, and I was like borderline embarrassed that I was crying, and that I had and that maybe you came to this realization too. I cried and got embarrassed that I had let it get that bad. And I didn't know that it was that severe until that moment, until that questionnaire calls it out. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, this is doing the most right now, but maybe this is what I need. I love that a lot of what you do. I mean, your content does not exclusively serve teens. It's a big part of what you do, but it's not solely what you do. What I have always felt, just as a person who's experienced treatment, that you're right. And there aren't a lot of resources for teens. I feel like it's an underserved demographic. So you've done the research, you've done the work, you've hit the ground running talking with teens of today. I was just curious about your findings, and what are teens talking about? What are they concerned most about when it comes to mental health?
I mean, everything. I think Gen Z is very aware and vulnerable about their mental health and what they're experiencing. And I think that's such a positive about this generation. I know
Mm-hmm.
older generations are like, they're so dramatic and why can't they just deal with things? But I think we're more vulnerable and more open to kind of verbalizing what we're experiencing, which is really courageous and a strength. But I think when it comes to the teen demographic, we know from a research perspective that 75% of mental illnesses develop by it's either 18 or 21. And so we know that
Mm.
teens are that vulnerable group. We know that it's a critical period for mental health, and that time frame really in a lot of way dictates what the rest of your life looks like. And so it's so important for teens to be educated and aware of mental health, and also have access to the resources that they need when they are struggling, so they can be put on the right path and set themselves up for long-term success. I think also there's so many things that make being a teen such a complicated and challenging experience. Every single person I've talked to is like, being a teen was really hard. It really
Yeah,
sucked.
it
Like
is.
everyone, it was like those years were horrible. Like it's a universal experience. And
Yes.
it doesn't matter what your home life looked like or what your school life looked like or your environment. It's just a really challenging period of time. You haven't had the runway to be able to set up your own support system. A lot of aspects of your life are decided for you. You haven't had the lived experiences to know how to cope with all the challenges you're navigating. You're for the first time really constructing and cultivating your sense of identity, which is really important when it comes to mental health. Teens are also biologically more emotional, we're less
Mm,
rational, and their brains aren't fully developed. And so while an adult might be able to logic through something and do a pros and cons and understand that right now doesn't impact their future, teens really lean more into that emotional side of things. They're not necessarily always capable of being like, okay, logically this isn't a big deal. We also know that teens put more of an emphasis on peer relationships and are
mm,
hypersensitive to rejection. So there's all of these things that really make it a perfect storm when it comes to mental health. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about making resources for that demographic in addition to my own lived experiences. But when it comes to what teens are struggling with, there's so many things. I think that
mm.
a general consensus is that school and academics provide a huge source of stress. There's a lot
Yeah,
of desire to be successful and get into certain colleges and perform well, and a lot of pressure on teens to thrive academically or in their extracurriculars or in their relationships, all of these things. And so that pressure can be really stressful and overwhelming, and that gets tied into your self esteem. There's a lot of burnout associated with that stress. And I think that also
yeah,
is tied to the lack of sleep. Teens are the most sleep deprived generation, and I think that has a huge impact on mental health as well. We talked about the relationship perspective where we're hypersensitive to rejection, but also placing more emphasis on peer relationships in that period of life where you're less close to your parents and family members. And so
mhm,
that becomes another challenge that teens are dealing with. There's a lot of feelings of feeling lonely or not feeling like you're heard or seen. The stress and burnout is a really big one. Low mood and feeling depressed and anxious, like all of these things teens are experiencing. But it's a lot of different things that create that perfect storm, and I think a lot of adults will chalk it up and to be like, it's phones, it's social media,
yeah,
no wonder everyone's depressed. And it's like, yes, teens are inundated with more information than anyone ever has been before. They're more connected than anyone ever has been before, but I think there's a lot more in that picture as well. And we know that teens are struggling more than they ever have historically. And so what can we do to support them through that and also
yeah.
direct resources their way so they can be supported?
Yeah, you have a wonderful set of resources on your own website too. That's one place. NAMI's a great resource. McLean's a great resource. Mayo Clinic is a great resource. All of that. Thankfully, the one benefit to there being easy access to tons of information today is that all of that is easily accessible.
Yeah.
I always thought, just my own observation in my own community, that a lot of teens today are over scheduled and like they have so much on their plates. They've got like five, there's some sort of extracurricular activity going on every weeknight on top of a tournament on the weekend or something like that. Like it just gets insane. And that has to be overwhelming. So I very much appreciate that like there's somebody or something out there to give them a little bit of a break and to have them feel heard. It's
Yeah.
amazing. You've talked about DBT as being, another awesome form of treatment. The biggest takeaways from what your experience has been with DBT and what it is as a treatment and how it's beneficial. What are some of those for anybody that might want to know more about it?
Yeah, I love DBT. DBT stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. It was created by an incredible woman named Marsha Linehan. She didn't share this into a while into her career, but she actually also struggled as a young adult. She
Mm,
struggled a lot with her mental health. She was hospitalized for a long period of time. And in that phase of life and in that period of life, she made a commitment to herself that she had been living in hell, was how she described it, and
yeah,
she made that commitment that she would go back to hell to rescue others and take them out of that dark space that she herself
yeah,
had experienced. And so she has an incredible career. She's so accomplished and has made such a positive impact in the mental health space, but she initially developed dialectical behavioral therapy for borderline personality patients. And at the time that she was developing this treatment, DBT, at the time that she was developing this treatment, BPD patients were not the most popular among therapists. A lot of clinicians didn't want them on their caseload because
Why?
well, first of all, they were super emotionally unstable and depressed and struggled in relationships. They were a really challenging case to navigate.
Mm.
It wasn't like someone coming in being like, I have anxiety. It was like, my entire life is a hot mess. I don't know how to feel my emotions. My relationships are a disaster. But then also, they had this really interesting mentality around getting treatment and getting
Mm.
support. And when you told them, you just need to accept the cards that you've been dealt and keep moving, they would say, so you're saying this is my fault. Like, you're telling me that I caused this and that this is all on me. But then when you said, um, like, you forgot the acceptance piece and you're like, let's change the situation, let's move forward, let's try this, they're like, do you not understand how painful this is? Like, you're telling me I have to solve all these problems that I haven't created for myself, and you haven't even acknowledged like how impossible this is
Mm.
to navigate. And so she created DBT on this dialectic of acceptance and change, and all of DBT kind of hinges on these dialectics, which is two seemingly opposing things that can be true at the same time. And so when you instead went to these patients and said, you are in a really shitty situation, your life is miserable. To you right now, your life is not worth living. And I see that and I know that. And it is so incredibly painful. And I am proud of you for showing up today. And
Beautiful start already. Yeah.
right? Like, everyone wants to hear that. Everyone's like, yes, every single day is a struggle and a challenge, and like, I'm fighting against myself, and thank you for acknowledging that. And then pairing with that, and we can help you. And there are things we can do to help you feel less overwhelmed and less distressed. And here's your path forward. And DBT as a treatment, when you navigate it, it's a couple of different things. You have individual therapy with a therapist, and your therapist sits on a board with other clinicians. They all collaborate and work together and consult on these cases. So there's a lot of support built in for therapists. If you are a teen, you're also doing family therapy. And
Mm.
then if you're doing DBT, like typical DBT, you also have phone coaching. So at any point, you can call your therapist, get support, get help, skills training, all of that. And then the final piece, which is what I share on the podcast and what most people think of when they think of DBT, is the skills education. And so you get this giant binder of skills that Marsha Linehan developed. And it's broken up into 4 modules, which is emotion regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness. And it's these 4
Mm.
areas of life that we all really need to function and thrive. And if you're living a happy, fulfilled, and balanced life, you're probably doing all these things. But if you struggle with your mental health, and you kind of touched on this, where you're like, how did I let it get this bad? You know that the more you struggle, the further you get away from these effective ways of coping. And it's like,
Yeah.
first you avoid, and then you're avoiding more and doing it unhealthy coping mechanisms, and then you're like getting validation ineffectively. It's like you just get further and further and further away, and you forget how to cope with things in a healthy way. And
Mm.
also, when you're really sensitive and experiencing these really big emotions and suicidal and self-harming and all these things, you don't really have that trust in yourself that you are able to survive your emotions, or that you can even cope with them. Like, that for me was one of the scariest things. Like, can I even actually sit with an emotion and handle that? Like, I was like, I don't know if
Mm.
I can. That seems really scary and overwhelming. And so within each of these modules is these really specific skills. And I'll give you a couple of examples. But like, if you're having a panic attack, you use the
Mhm.
stop scale. And you stop, you take a step back, you observe, and then you proceed mindfully. And when you're having that panic attack, after you've paused in that situation, the skill you implement, and of course, depending on the person, they'll use different skills. But just for an example, you use the tip skill. And what you're going to do is you're going to bowl of ice water. You're going to dunk your face in that ice water, hold your breath, dunk it, take a breath, dunk it, and keep going until you calm down. And this stimulates your mammalian diving reflex. And it, through your vagus nerve, which runs under your eyes, it lowers your heart rate and it lowers your blood pressure. And so your heart
Mm.
rate and blood pressure have been really elevated from this emotional reaction. And your body can't maintain that level of physical arousal for a long period of time. And your mammalian diving reflex is what your body does when it thinks you're diving into cold water, and it knows you're going to be underwater, so you can't be producing a lot of carbon dioxide or you'll drown. So your body's like, okay, heart rate's slow. We're diving in the Arctic. Like, we got to be able to survive this jump in the pool. We got to lower the heart rate immediately. And so if you're having a panic attack, a lot of people are like, I'm dying. Like, the physical element is what's really, really scary. And
Mm-hmm.
so knowing 100% of the time I do this, my heart rate will lower, my blood pressure will lower, and then I can focus on the mental. It's like, oh my god, I know exactly how to handle the situation. I know I have a skill that will help me get through this, and I know it works 100% of the time. And then, like, for relationships, there's a skill called dear man, which is when you have to advocate for your objectives. So maybe you're setting a boundary, maybe you're asking for an accommodation in school, maybe you're asking for time off to a boss. Literally
Mm-hmm.
anything where you have an objective, and describe
Yes.
the situation, you express emotionally what's going on, you assert, so you ask your question in a yes or no way, you give them reinforcements, what's in it for them, you're mindful, you appear confident, and then you negotiate. And that is how you navigate that interpersonal situation. So it's all of these skills that are kind of like a roadmap to life in a healthy way. And for I know that whenever I was in therapy and I'd go in and the therapist would be like, well, what do you think? And I'd be like, I wouldn't be here if I knew the
If I
solution.
knew, yeah,
Like,
we've all had that.
I don't know. So please tell me what to do. And DBT therapists, they tell you the scope. Of course, they'll be like, well, what are you not telling me? Or like, you know the answer. So, like, tell me because you're like being coy about it. But there's a lot of that. You're depressed. Here's the skill we used. You're anxious. Here's the skill we used. You had an argument. Here's how we're going to repair that relationship. And for someone whose life feels like a disaster and overwhelming and so distressing, that gives a like really helps with the anxiety and the hope and buy-in when it comes to recovery. But that's kind of the TLDR of DBT, and initially developed for adults with borderline personality disorder. Since then it has been adapted and studied in so many different demographics, whether it's
Yeah.
adolescents with depression and anxiety, adults that are depressed, OCD, eating disorders, like so many different things. And it has really high success rates from a clinical perspective. It really, really works for individuals that are struggling with those specific things, which can be rare in treatment. Like with talk
Yeah.
therapy, the most important determinant in outcomes is the relationship with a therapist. And with DBT, you know that the skills and the framework and this really detailed process is what is getting those results. And so it's really an incredible development in the field of mental health.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were listing everything that's part of it, I was like, that wait, we learned mindfulness in my treatment. Wait, we did social rhythm therapy. We're talking about like staying on a schedule, staying routine, things like that. It's like, wait, we did that in treatment. And I was not diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. So, ta-da, of course they're using it. Those core skills, anyway, what I'm getting at, are used for multiple forms of treatment across the board. And I love that we're realizing this now and using those core elements, and that it's not just exclusively for, one mental illness.
Yeah.
So we learned so much. You're so insightful. I love talking to you. What is next for you? What can we look forward to, whether it's from you or She Persisted? What's next?
Yes. Do we even know? Right now, I'm
No, probably
we'll
not.
never know for sure. But
Yeah.
right now, just finishing up college, I'm have one more year, and so all the things when it comes to classes and research, and then continuing down the path of becoming a clinical psychologist. And with the
Yes.
podcast, continuing weekly episodes, continuing to bring really incredible experts on and share my own experience as much as possible, and do the same on social media to make the information as accessible as possible. And who knows long term, but yeah, just continuing to do the same and just try and share the story as much as possible.
Let's go. That's the energy we're on. I love that. Thank you so much for your time, for your insight. Sadie, thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you for having me.